Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Leo.
I'm Joel.
For anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books we've read or books that we are in the process of reading. We dive into both fiction and nonfiction books. The only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it, and we want to include you in the conversation. Joel, what are we talking about today?
Today we'll be talking about The Master and Margarita
by Mikhail Bulgakov.
Great book, lasting impact, powerful, and humorous.
Joel, I'm very excited for a discussion about this book. You will be, I don't know how you're going to react, but I think this is going to end up being maybe 4 or 5 parts of a discussion just because there's so much to talk about.
I don't mind that, but I believe the numbers are that people stop listening when we hit part 3.
Who knows? We're going to find out.
No, I can pull up the website that says how many downloads for every episode.
Do we have anything longer than 3 parts?
No, which is why we should probably leave it at 3 parts.
What if we have 1 mega episode? As usual, we are going to talk a little bit about the author. We'll run through a quick overview of the story itself, and then we're going to go into deeper dives in this book a little bit more chapter by chapter than we usually do. Again, it's just so dense and rich with material. So we'll see what happens. Okay, Joel, tell us about the author.
All right, let's first set the stage in historical context. In the 1890s, the Russian Empire was a nation caught between tradition and modernization. Ruled by autocratic czars, Russia remained overwhelmingly rural, and most people living as poor peasants. Decades after the abolition of serfdom in 1861, we see rapid industrialization. It transformed cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. It drew workers into factories, created new social tensions. We see a rapid development of social inequalities, political repression, demands for reform. All while these revolutionary ideas were spreading, they became quite powerful amongst intellectuals and students. At first, the empire appeared powerful and stable, but really so many of the internal pressures would eventually erupt in the Russian Revolution, and we can see Bulgakov's childhood blossoming in this beautiful Russian Revolution era, and we can see the society, it's unbalanced in between the imperial order and the rapidly pressurized change into the modern society.
Mikhail Bulgakov was born in 1891 in Kiev, which was then part of the Russian Empire. He grew up in an educated household surrounded by books, religion, and intellectual debate. His father was a theology professor, and young Mikhail seemed destined for a respectable professional life. Instead of becoming a writer, he first chose medicine, earning a medical degree and working as a doctor in remote rural hospitals. Those difficult years, treating desperate patients with limited resources, would later provide material for some of his most vivid stories. The tensions continually rose until the outbreak of the Russian Revolution and the subsequent overthrow of the Tsars in 1917. In October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a coup promising peace, land, and bread. Bulgakov found himself caught between competing armies, political upheaval, and social collapse. He abandoned medicine and turned to writing, believing literature could make sense of a world that seemed to have lost its reason. By the early 1920s, he had moved to Moscow, hoping to build a literary career in the new Soviet state.
His work was very impactful, and he attracted audiences. He had a quick wit. He would gain their attention, but his problem is that he refused to write propaganda. Most of his work would be a satire of bureaucracy, human folly, questioning official narratives, and as the government tightened its control under Joseph Stalin, his plays were banned one after another. Publishers refused his manuscripts, theaters canceled productions, and he found himself isolated and unable to earn a living.
In the very restrictive, controlling culture of the USSR, Bulgakov found it increasingly difficult to make a living and use his art the way he wanted to support himself. He wrote directly to Stalin in 1930 asking either for permission to work or permission to leave the Soviet Union. Unexpectedly, Stalin personally telephoned him. The conversation saved Bulgakov from complete ruin. securing him work in the theater, but it did not restore him his freedom as a writer. He remained trapped in a system that tolerated his existence while suppressing his art. One of the ironic things that I read in the introduction to the version I read of this book was that Stalin himself saw one of Bulgakov's plays 15 times. So Stalin was a personal fan. During these difficult years, Bulgakov poured his energy into the novel that would become his masterpiece, The Master and Margarita. The book tells the story of the devil visiting Moscow, exposing corruption, hypocrisy, and fear through dark comedy and fantasy. It was a bold work that could never have been published during his lifetime. Bulgakov revised it obsessively while battling illness, convinced that the story mattered even if no one would read it.
By the 1930s, his health was failing. Suffering from a hereditary kidney disease, he continued dictating revisions to his wife almost until the end. He died in 1940 at the age of 49, largely unknown outside literary circles and unable to see his greatest work published. But don't worry. Decades later, during a period of political thaw, The Master Margarita finally appeared in print and became one of the most celebrated novels of the 20th century. The writer, who had spent much of his life silenced by authority, ultimately outlived the regime that tried to suppress him. His life became a testimony to a belief echoed through his work. Manuscripts and ideas have a way of surviving.
So that is our overview on Bulgakov himself. Let's run through an overview of the novel's story so everyone kind of has a broad picture idea, and then we'll go, as our normal style is, deep dives throughout. So the novel opens in Moscow, where a literary editor and a poet meet a mysterious foreign professor named Woland. During their conversation, Woland claims that Jesus existed and predicts that the editor will soon die. Moments later, the prediction comes true. This strange event begins a chain of strange occurrences that spread across the city as the novel progresses. The reader learns that the professor's name is Woland, and almost as quickly learns that he is the devil in human form. Accompanying him are a bizarre group of supernatural followers, including the child-sized talking cat named Behemoth, the assassin like Azazelo, and the vampiric Hela. Together they move through Moscow, creating chaos and exposing the greed, vanity, and dishonesty of the people they encounter. As rumors spread, theater managers disappear, officials are driven insane, and audiences become victims of elaborate supernatural pranks. At one performance, spectators are showered with money and luxury goods, only to discover later that the gifts suddenly vanish or turn into trash. The city becomes increasingly paranoid as nobody can explain what is happening, and that's saying a lot because of the Soviet level of paranoia that already exists in the Moscow of this time.
In many ways, when we read Russian literature, I find that their setting is Moscow as opposed to the American setting of New York City. It seems to be almost a one-to-one when I read literary devices like, oh, you just go to New York City, or, oh, you just go to Moscow.
That makes sense.
But they also have St. Petersburg, which I don't think we have such a great cultural impact that Russia has for both of those cities as compared to what we have.
I would agree.
So back to the story. At the same time, the novel introduces a character referred to as the Master, a writer who has authored a novel about Pontius Pilate and the trial of Jesus. Literary critics condemn his work not because it is poorly written, but because it conflicts with the ideology of the Soviet state. Overwhelmed by rejection and persecution, the Master burns his manuscript and withdraws from society. All these fun themes we'll dive deeper into in just a little bit. The Master eventually ends up in a psychiatric hospital. There he tells the story to another patient, the poor poet who has crossed paths with Woland. Through these conversations, the reader learns how the Master's life was destroyed and how he lost faith in both literature and himself.
The Master's only source of happiness had been Margarita, the woman he loved. Unlike the Master, Margarita remains free, but she is miserable without him. She refuses to accept that he is gone and continues searching for a way to reunite with him. One day, Woland's followers approach Margarita with an offer. If she agrees to assist them, she will be rewarded. Desperate to find the Master, she accepts their offer. Through magical means, she becomes a witch and gains the power to fly across the Moscow night. Margarita is then chosen to host Woland's annual ball. The guests are murderers, tyrants, poisoners, and criminals drawn from the depths of history. As hostess, she must greet each of them as they arrive. The event is exhausting and surreal, but she endures it in the hope of finally seeing the master again.
We can see woven in between this novel, we find the master's novel itself. These chapters take place in ancient Jerusalem and follow Pontius Pilate as he interrogates Jesus. Pilate believes Jesus is innocent but lacks the courage to oppose political pressure. He authorizes the execution and spends the rest of his life haunted by guilt. As the story approaches its climax, Wolin reveals that the master's manuscript was never truly lost. The famous line, "Manuscripts don't burn," becomes a central idea of the novel. Through the master's attempts to destroy his work, the truth it contains survives.
Wolin finally reunites the master and Margarita, yet he does not grant them a triumphant return to ordinary life. Instead, they are released from their suffering and given peace beyond the struggle of the world that rejected them. In the final scenes, Pilate is also freed from his centuries of torment. The separate storylines, the devil in Moscow, the master and Margarita, and the story of Pilate, merge into a single conclusion. The novel ends by arguing that power can suppress truth for a time, but it cannot destroy it, and that love, art, and conscience can outlast even the most oppressive regimes.
And I believe we see the author's true structure here, and that in his novel, truth outlives the regime, and he himself, his work, outlives the regime. What a poetic end to a beautiful piece.
Okay, Joel, let's take a quick break to hear some interlude music and jump into our discussion.
All right, and we're back, and we're going to get deep into this discussion. We can talk about the Phantom and the Professor. As we can see in the first scene, we meet the editor, Berlioz.
I pronounce it Berlioz. I don't know if that's the correct way to pronounce it, but that's the way in my head that I've pronounced it. For the reader, this is Berlioz, which I just say Berlioz.
And the poet Homeless. They meet on a spring afternoon at Patriarch Ponds, where Berlioz lectures the young man on how he should alter an atheistic poem about Jesus to be even more atheistic. At one point, the apparition of a man appears suddenly in front of Berlioz. You want to read this quote?
The sweltering air thickened before him, and a transparent citizen of the strangest appearance wove himself out of it. A peaked jockey's cap on his little head, a short checkered jacket also made of air. A citizen 7 feet tall, but narrow in the shoulders, unbelievably thin, and, kindly note, with a jeering physiognomy.
What great literary writing.
I love the writing here.
This vision scares Berlioz and gives him a sharp chest pain, but both the fright and pain eventually fade. The reader, like Berlioz, is left wondering whether the event is simply hallucination or something more supernatural. The two men continue their conversation, and after a while, a stranger walks up and insinuates himself into the conversation. He calls himself a professor and a consultant on black magic. He is tall, has platinum crowns on the left side and gold on the right. He was wearing an expensive gray suit and imported shoes of a matching color. His gray beret was cocked rakishly over one ear. Don't even know what rakishly means. Under his arm, he carried a stick with a black knob shaped like a poodle's head. He looked to be a little over 40, mouth somewhat twisted, clean-shaven, dark hair, right eye black, left for some reason green, dark eyebrows, but one higher than the other, in short, a foreigner.
Okay, Joel, I want to take a little detour here during this first scene, and I want to talk about that phrase. The phrase specifically that I want to talk about is "for some reason." I think it'll add to our overall discussion and appreciation of this book and Russian literature in general. So we'll eventually be covering a lot more Russian literature in the podcast, I hope. So I think this is a good time to talk about this. And specifically, like I said, the phrase I want to point out in that description was for some reason, and it comes in the description of the professor's eyes. Quote, right eye black, left, for some reason, green, end quote. I've noticed a pattern of this phrase and others like it occurring throughout this book and also Dostoevsky's books that we've read. When I first encountered this pattern, I wondered how much of it was a part of the author's writing style and how much of it was an artifact of natural discourse in the original Russian language. And from what I could tell from a little digging around, it seems to be both a purposeful literary device and also a feature of natural Russian discourse. But the balance seems to be more heavily on the language and culture side. So Joel, I gathered some phrases here, and I know you know a little bit of Russian. And here are some phrases that are also qualifiers of this nature. So the one we saw is for some reason.
Почему-то, for some reason.
We've also got somehow, as
Как-то.
if it so happened.
Как буду.
Apparently.
Так вышло.
Suddenly.
Позднее.
And there's a phrase that's often translated as without knowing why, but you were telling me that this is not something that you know how to say without it being embedded within a sentence.
This one, it really depends on what the whole sentence is.
Right.
Because Russian changes so rapidly. Like, for example, the word one has 6 different forms. So if you ask, how do you say one in Russian? I can't really tell you until...
You have to know the context.
Unless you tell me the context.
Okay. So an example of a literal translation of a phrase like this will often sound like, for some reason he became angry. Where in English we would usually say, he suddenly became angry, or he grew irritated. There would be a greater tendency for us to simply omit the qualifier. And from what I can tell so far, Russian often leaves causation psychologically open. English writing generally favors more explicit causality, at least when compared to Russian writing. Again, very, very generally. So in English, we might express he was tired because, he laughed because, she hesitated because, where Russian writing is much more comfortable saying something like, he laughed for some reason, or he suddenly felt uneasy, without immediately explaining why. The emphasis is more on the experience before being explanatory. And very broadly speaking, still, the Russian literature we have encountered so far seems to be more interested in depicting consciousness as fluid, contradictory, and partly mysterious. Russian has many common expressions that soften certainty. Russian has
many common expressions that soften certainty. Russian uses the conditional or the conditional mood, conditional tense, more similar to English than we see in, say, Romance languages. Romance languages, like Spanish or Italian and Portuguese, have tenses with different levels of certainty based on how you create that tense, or basically how you conjugate that word. Russian often adds words like we see in English, as in would be, to be, etc. Chai budu, that means would it be, would you be tea, which is just a way of saying, would you like to have tea? English, we would say, I would want tea. We don't change would to anything else. We also don't have different levels of tenses that we have to conjugate together. Russian is the same way.
Dostoevsky and Bulgakov seem to use these certainty softenings to different effects. Dostoevsky is obsessed with people acting against their own stated motives. Characters constantly do things that even they don't understand. For example, a Dostoevsky character might think, for some reason I hated him. The point is precisely that the character doesn't know why, and for Dostoevsky, that uncertainty is psychologically important. Mikhail Bulgakov often uses these phrases in this novel to create an atmosphere where reality itself feels unstable, as we will see throughout our discussion of this book, and as we can see just in these opening scenes. For example, a character might inexplicably change their mind, forget something obvious, feel fear, or accept absurd events, quote, for some reason. Importantly, this disruption and blurring of explicit causality, the way Bulgakov uses it, gives The Master and Margarita a dreamlike quality. This book exhibits a beautiful blend of realistic, ordinary-seeming people encountering supernatural absurdity. It is riveting and hard to take your eyes off of. Joel, I'm sorry for that tangent, that we took quite a bigger detour than intended, but now let's get back to these opening scenes at Patriarch Pons with the mysterious professor insinuating himself into the conversation between the literary editor Berlioz and Ivan Homeless, the poet.
Great. So going back to the scene, we see this sudden apparition. And Leo, how did you feel about that first encounter? This is the opening scene to a masterfully written novel.
When I first read it, I think as the reader, I had the same kind of experience as Berlioz and Ivan, that the sudden ghostly appearance, okay, is this supernatural? Is this fantasy? Is this real? Because everything seems completely normal and mundane. This is just a mundane conversation between Berlioz and Ivan, and then there's an apparition. And so the question immediately begins, what genre of literature am I reading here? Berlioz wants to believe it's a hallucination at first, and me as the reader, I'm also left in that kind of ambiguous state. And that, for me, immediately starts off that dreamlike quality that happens throughout the whole novel, because it is this weird mixture of very realistic people, settings, and scenes with supernatural and dark fantasy happenings.
We do have that. It almost, in some ways, not to denigrate this particular work, it feels like modern science. It feels like modern science fiction, where we see a modern day setting put into a parallel universe, and then you add in whatever magical or fantastical aspect of that. Where I think Bulgakov really does a great job of capturing real people and real characters. And I think we can see this in a lot of Russian literature, especially during this era after the Russian Revolution, where the life itself becomes hyper real inside of the writing and in plays and everything else. And then interwoven in here, we see this fantasy style writing where things happen so magically, it seemingly so. And in this case, we'll see throughout the book itself, it has so many particular pieces and moments where, how in the world did this happen? This is either magical or supernatural. Meanwhile, the characters themselves and the places themselves are all real, and they are very, in some ways, hyper real, I would say.
So, Joel, for me, when the apparition appeared and then we later get the description of the professor, I was a little confused about whether they were one and the same or not. Did you have a similar experience when you were reading it the first time?
I guess when I'm reading the book, I don't think about it till I'm done. So when I was reading it, I just kept reading.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the reasons that I read a little slow, is that I'm reflecting on what I'm reading as I'm reading it. I'll often, scene by scene or blow by blow in the book, I will be thinking about what I'm reading, my reactions to it, and impressions.
Like the current book we're reading, you would be having a theory of mind applied at all times.
Right.
All right, let's get into the actual descriptions of the appearances of both the apparition and the professor. Starting with the apparition, we see, quote, the sweltering air thickened before him, and a transparent citizen of the strangest appearance wove himself out of it. A peaked jockey's cap on his little head, a short checkered jacket also made of air. A citizen 7 feet tall, but narrow in the shoulders, unbelievably thin, and, kindly note, with a jeering physiognomy. I
really like the little phrase in there, kindly note, just the kind of cheekiness of the narrator voice. I really, really appreciate that. So in that description, some of the things that stood out to me that I wanted to just highlight was a jockey's cap. The physical appearance of a jockey's cap, of someone being a polo rider. A jockey's cap is a lightweight, brimmed cap originally worn by horse racing jockeys. It generally consists of a snug crown, a top button, and a long projecting visor. In modern professional racing, it serves as a colorful fabric, a hat silk, it's called, stretched over a mandatory certified safety helmet. And then to jeer means to taunt or scoff at someone. Jeering is the act of shouting, mocking, or laughing at someone in a loud, abusive, or contemptuous way. It involves expressing ridicule and showing a complete lack of respect, usually in a public or group setting. And then physiognomy, that word can mean several different things, but in this case, it means just facial features. So his facial features are ridiculing, they're mocking, they're inappropriately contemptuous and mocking. Joel, any thoughts there on the apparition, his appearance?
No, he sounds like a funny guy.
That is part of the humor. Now, a little bit more fascinating to me, let's talk about the description of the professor himself. So he's got platinum and gold crowns. On the left side is the platinum. On the right side is the gold. He's wearing expensive clothes. He's got a gray beret that was, quote, cocked rakishly over one ear. And under his arm, he's carrying a stick with a black knob shaped like a poodle's head. He also has eyes of different colors. His right eye is black and the left is green. So let's look at a few of these. The black poodle's head. This seems to be a reference to Goethe's Faust, where the devil character in that story, Mephistopheles, first gets Faust convinced that he's the devil, and Faust has him take the form of a black poodle. So that seems to be a very direct reference to Mephistopheles and highlights the fact that we are dealing with the devil. The gold and platinum dental crowns I thought were a little more difficult and poking around. One interpretation I saw that is maybe the different metals reinforce that he is an entity who is a strange mixture of evil and good, or maybe the gold represents greed and platinum represents something higher or more pure. Thoughts there, Joel? Do you have any theories on the different crowns?
I don't have any theories. I don't know what it would represent to have gold on one and platinum on the other.
I think, I have the tendency to jump overboard and go a little deeper on some of the imagery and symbols. And I think you could do a good job of reeling me back in on that. So there's not much there for you that jumps out to you.
No, I don't see anything. Sometimes when we have these descriptions, it's like, yes, this is a very fun description. Sometimes it's easy to pick out like, oh, this means something more. And other times I think it's just the description. All you see is what there is.
And there's also the question of, and again, talking about theory of mind here, there's also the question of what consciously is being put in to the story and the description and the word choices by the author, and what's he's just conveying unconsciously. It seems to me, because we know how long and painstakingly he worked on the novel, 12 years at least, that every word is probably chosen very carefully. And we know how meticulous and just what caliber of writer he was. So there was probably a reason for every single word chosen. That's my personal theory. And the black poodle head, I think, is kind of obvious because it is so specific. Now, the dental crowns, on the other hand, if Bulgakov had something in mind, it eludes me. But those are the theories that I have or that I found. And then what about the eyes? The black eye is described as dead and expressionless, and this maybe symbolizes death or the transition of the soul and the dark side of existence. The green eye is described as completely mad, representing maybe demonic forces or the dark beginnings of the human soul. Together, they signify that Woland is neither purely evil nor purely good, but a paradoxical figure who exposes hypocrisy and enforces a form of justice.
That's possible. I could see that. Where the devil himself is not an evil guy. He is another angel doing his work by doing the necessary actions that God doesn't do. That's one way of looking at it. Although I think that's hard because I don't know enough about Eastern Orthodox religion, but they definitely have in their lexicon's not the right word. What's the right word?
Cultural imagery.
I can't think of there's a single word that means group of thoughts, beliefs, and shared words.
Zeitgeist.
Yeah, something like that. Anyways, so I did see that when I was over in Kazakhstan, the remaining churches of Eastern Russian Orthodoxy had depictions of devils and demons and other things like that. So we have that within the realm of shared ideology of that there is evil forces. But I've also seen people put the devil as not evil, but rather doing the work similar to Hades, where he's not necessarily a bad guy, but someone has to do this work. Someone has to punish sinners for their actions.
That's almost the image of medieval executioners. I know we're taking a little bit of a tangent, but from reading about medieval executioners, they were doing a necessary job for the society they were living in, but they were also a kind of pariah. They were like an inside outsider, if that makes sense. There was a respect for them, but there was also a kind of superstitious distancing socially from them. In a lot of instances and in cultures within medieval Europe, executioners could only marry into families of other executioners. And there was a lot of social rules that kind of walled them off and reinforced their separateness. But at the same time, they were an important part of the society. So very, very interesting. And that is a person who is carrying out the law and being the part of the law that metes out physical justice and consequences. But at the same time, they are committing an act that may be morally questionable, even though it is sanctioned by law. Interesting, right?
Yeah, very interesting.
So I think this may be a good time to look at the epigraph of the book itself before we dig any further. And the epigraph comes from the scene entitled Faust's Study in the first part of the play, also called Faust, written by Goethe that we mentioned earlier. And the question is asked by Faust himself, and the answer comes from the demon Mephistopheles. So it begins, "Who are you then?" And Mephistopheles answers, "I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good." End quote. And we can see, Bulgakov, I think, in my opinion, you tell me what you think, Joel, lays this reference on thickly in the first chapter. Here's an excerpt that I think reinforces this. "So you've been invited here as a consultant, Professor?" To which he answers, "Yes, a consultant."
"You're German?" Homeless inquires.
And here the professor says, Yes, perhaps I am German."
"You speak real good Russian."
"Oh, I'm generally a polyglot and know a great number of languages," the professor replies.
"And what is your field?"
"I'm a specialist in black magic." So to me, and I want to know what you think, Joel, I threw this in here specifically hoping to see your reaction. But for me, that really lays on the emphasis of Faust and Mephistopheles here. He deals in black magic. He kind of teasingly goes along with Ivan's question of, "Oh, you're German." And we know Goethe is German. What do you think?
That would be a good connection. It does lay it on. I know nothing about Faust or any of that stuff, but it seems like we have a black poodle head. We have German. That sounds great. Maybe Germans are just representations of the devil for Russians.
Who knows?
We didn't make it to... he didn't write this in 1939, so he wouldn't have gotten that idea.
Right.
But nonetheless.
So maybe we can do an episode one day on Faust.
That would be interesting. I've never read it. All right. Talking about the title of the first chapter itself, we can see the title is Never Talk with Strangers, which makes sense for poor Ivan Homeless and Berlioz. Ivan gets put in a mental hospital and Berlioz is moments from literally losing his head, and both of these are predicted by the professor. The title of the chapter is also ironic because during the time it was written, the Russian people were in the grips of Communist Party obsessions with spies and espionage.
So right from the title, in my opinion, that starts off with humor and specifically Soviet humor.
Sure. I remember talking with people that lived during the Soviet Union when I was over there in Central Asia, and there is this paranoia that develops around people coming over and talking with you because you were either in the Communist Party or you were not in the Communist Party, and if you weren't, why weren't you a member of the Communist Party? It seems like the Soviet Union had their own McCarthy-style era where they had the Red Scare, but in this case it would be the scare of you're not a part of the Communist Party. And in the same way that America persecuted communists over in Russia, it seemed like they would have espionage and also persecute people that were anti-communist in any capacity.
And a weird dichotomy where in the East it was you're looked at suspiciously if you are not communist enough.
Right.
And we ran into an era in the 1950s of McCarthyism where if you were even just a little communist in appearance or action or disposition, you could easily become victim to what was called the Red Scare at the time.
And we can tie this to our most recent episode where we talked about the mysterious potential death
of Albert Camus.
And how, because he was writing against the Communist Party, they might have sanctioned his assassination, as we have seen other authors actually tied to the Communist Party in the USSR assassinating political dissenters.
Right, a conspiratorial theory that has a lot of precedent for being true. Not surprising in the least if it ever turned out to be true if we got the evidence.
So pulling it back to this, I think in this book, as well as in other literature we can read at the time, there is an obsession with people being spies, with people telling on their neighbors if there was something against the party. A more totalitarian control that we can see.
Right. I agree that strongly comes through in this book. And it's all implicit. Even though he never published this during his life, and he never even thought it would get published, he still was hedging his own safety and only implied these things. So the secret police, and we'll talk about this, the secret police get implied and seen off the page and not on stage throughout the book, but their presence is very much in the book. It's never explicit. That would be too on the nose, too dangerous in Soviet Russia.
Okay, any other thoughts on this?
No, I would love to move on and talk about Pontius Pilate.
Now, let's get into Pontius Pilate. Leo, take us in.
Okay, in chapter 2 and 3, we start to get our first glimpses of the characters Pontius Pilate and Yeshua. Let's start with Pilate. The professor argues with the two atheists and tells them matter-of-factly that there really was a Jesus character, and he only refers to this character as Yeshua, and we'll come to that a little further. To convince them, he launches into a very detailed story about Pontius Pilate meeting and sentencing a man named Yeshua. Pilate is portrayed as an easily angered man and suffering from severe pain on one side of his head that is making him more temperamental and seemingly world-weary. Pilate seems to want to spare Yeshua and talk with him more, but then upon hearing that Yeshua is accused of speaking poorly of the emperor, Pilate reluctantly and wrathfully condemns Yeshua to death. Joel, if you're good with it, I would like to read a few excerpts from chapter 2 to start getting a sense of who Pilate is and to enjoy the beautiful prose.
Let's get right into it.
You want me to read it, or
Yes.
would you like to read it? Okay.
I'll let you read this one.
Okay. Quote, "In a white cloak with blood-red lining, with the shuffling gait of a cavalryman, early in the morning of the 14th day of the spring month of Nisan, there came out to the covered colonnade between the two wings of the palace of Herod the Great, the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. More than anything in the world, the procurator hated the smell of rose oil, and now everything foreboded a bad day, because this smell had been pursuing the procurator since dawn." End quote. And then later on, Pontius Pilate says to himself, "O gods, gods, why do you punish me?" And he's referencing his terrible headaches. Further on, at another point, Pilate realizes he has to pass judgment on someone who we will quickly learn is Yeshua. Bulgakov writes that, quote, "The procurator twitched his cheek and said quietly, 'Bring in the accused,'" end quote.
So let's talk about Pilate, how he's described, how he comes off. We can talk about the headache, and we can talk about how much of a sympathetic character he is, or isn't.
So the professor tells the story as if he was there in person. When you first read this part, Joel, did you think he was one of the characters in the narrative?
Woland?
Woland, yeah.
It didn't seem like he was there. Maybe he was an observer. He said that he was there. I think that was a funny part. I remember one of our colleagues during the in-person session very animatedly being like, "Oh yeah, Yeshua's real, and I was there. Let me tell you all about it." And it's an exciting insert into the story itself. But I didn't see him as a character. I just saw him as a observer.
That's the way I saw it as well. But both Ivan and Berlioz and we as the reader have the experience of him giving an extremely vivid, extremely accurate retelling of the events as if he was there. He does almost like in a aside manner later on. I think chapter 3 tells them, I was there incognito on the balcony. But we never see from what perspective he's actually telling the story. It's told from a almost omniscient viewpoint, as you can see from the inside view of Pontius Pilate's mind. Interestingly, a little tangent here, in my head, I think we get the internal inside view of Pilate's mind, but I don't think we ever get that for Yeshua. I think that's kind of the characterization and the brushstrokes that portray Yeshua as a character, and I'm just now realizing that. Am I right in that? Do you remember at any point where we get an inside view of Yeshua's thinkings?
I don't remember Yeshua's thinkings. What about Matthew Levy?
It's not coming to mind. No, actually, I think it is, because we get to see, like, when he's sitting there writing his account later on the hill. Much later on, we'll talk about that, where he's recounting everything, and he's kind of suffering for his zealous nature that he's taken upon himself.
Yeah, Matthew Levy is a fun character.
Very interesting character.
So we really get to see Pilate's perspective from Wolin's account, and we see the agonizing headache, which will come up again and again. What do you think of how Pilate acts in this case? Because he's intrigued by Yeshua, even seems to like Yeshua, and yet he has to fulfill his obligation because he said something bad about the emperor.
Right. Pilate, to me, seems very torn. He seems like a very torn figure. That's the way he comes off the page to me. It seems like he is being pulled in different directions of his duty to the emperor and what would be fair. He sees Yeshua as a very sympathetic figure, at least my interpretation of it. And he also feels completely bound in duty to the emperor. So on the one hand, like, he knows this is an innocent man. He knows this man, is only a healer in a way, and we'll get into that. But on the other side, he just can't let go of his absolute duty to fulfill the law. And so there's no wiggle room for him, and he's stuck in the middle. So for me, there's that tug of war between duty and fairness. I think there's also a little bit of tension there between individual and community, which is a tension we see at play in most literature and most books we go through, where Pilate, the individual, what would be best for him would be to stop working and go hang out with his dog or go take a relaxing walk with this intriguing Yeshua character and relax. And so his headaches will subside. But his duty to the community and his duty to the laws requires him to do things he doesn't want to do, even going so far as to authorize the execution of Yeshua.
Right.
Do you see tensions in him? Do you see that torn nature? Does he come off a little differently for you?
I think the way Bulgakov writes it is it's meant to be read as it is a tension. It is meant to be this Pontius Pilate really cares about Yeshua, likes him and enjoys him as a person, and doesn't see anything wrong that he did, and in some ways tries to egg him to let him off the hook. Let Pontius Pilate release Yeshua from punishment. And he kind of wants to push that way, and he wishes Yeshua would recant or deny or do anything else to where he wasn't forced to make this action. In this way, though, he seems internally torn, but he always seems duty-bound in my head. It never seems like a question in Pilate's mind. Oh, can I get away with letting Yeshua go? That never enters. He's trying to find other, subtler ways to avoid punishing him.
Another tension I see in this character is, I'm going to describe it as a fear of Yeshua's potential truth that he brings to light versus Pontius Pilate's own worldview that seems to be threatened by that. And then, what I mean by that is Yeshua is saying, hey, there's some problems with too much accumulated authority. There's a problem with oppressiveness, and everyone has goodness inside of them, and then we don't need these oppressive structures as much if we let the individual flourish a little more, which is a direct threat to Pontius Pilate's worldview. He is brought up in the imperial system. He is a he has benefited greatly from the imperial system. He has reached the very high rank of procurator. So while he may have resonating and sympathetic feelings for what Yeshua is saying, for me, I also see fear there, fear of what that might mean for the world he is inundated in and surrounded by and has benefited from. Do you see that? And do you see that fear? Or I think the first time we were talking about this, you didn't see fear so much.
No, what you said makes sense. I agree with you. I also have a hard time with Pilate's actions. To me, seem like he is forced to do it, but is he being a coward by not listening? Because, Yeshua makes sense with this power dynamic, the aggregation of power, and this ruler, especially if you have an evil ruler, especially back then when it's a little bit more totalitarian. When does it become cowardly to just follow the order of the law that it is right now versus being brave to go against what is developing? But he's in a position of power.
Right. And from the imperial viewpoint, the cowardly versus brave question may be inverted, because it would be brave for him in the imperial viewpoint to stand up for what is best for the empire and the emperor, even against his personal feelings and inclinations.
Right? Yeah,
And then layered on top of all of this is the fact that there's a extreme power imbalance and a totalitarian style governmental force at work here, grinding up individuals inside of a novel that's being written under the Soviet regime by a writer who, is scared for his life and livelihood.
Yeah, and in which plenty of writers during that time went missing or disappeared.
Yeah, they'll just disappear if you say something you shouldn't or write something you shouldn't.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on Pilate before we get into the other main character in this recall?
No, there's a lot more to say about Pilate, and we will as we get more and more chapters that bring in the Pilate story. But let's move on to Yeshua.
Okay. Yeshua that we see in this Pontius Pilate narrative is quite different from the biblical Jesus, but he clearly has basically the Jesus-like qualities. He has the power of insight. He seems to have the ability to heal. Another quirk of Bulgakov's Yeshua is that he's very insistent on calling everyone a good man, and all groups of people, good people. This includes, without hesitation, Pilate, Ratslayer, and Judas. Yeshua claims that he does not start trouble, that all the trouble around him is caused by Matthew Levy, who follows him and writes down everything incorrectly, which we do see in a very humorous fashion is quite true. When asked, Yeshua eagerly recounts to Pilate that he said to Judas, what he said to Judas that got him arrested. Quote, I said that all power is violence over people, and that a time will come when there will be no power of the Caesars, nor any other power. Man will pass into the kingdom of truth and justice, where generally there will be no need for any power at all. End quote.
What an attack on the Soviet system and the Roman imperial system.
Yeah.
And then Pilate responds later on, and why did you stir up the people in the bazaar, you vagrant, talking about the truth of which you have no notion? What is truth? End quote. And then here Bulgakov describes that Pilate starts thinking about drinking poison to put himself out of his misery and end his life.
Yeshua insightfully describes Pilate and his condition. Quote, the truth is, first of all, that your head aches, and aches so badly that you're having faint-hearted thoughts of death. You're not only unable to speak to me, but it is even hard for you to look at me, and I am now your unwilling torturer, which upsets me. You can't even think about anything and only dream that your dog should come, apparently the one being you are attached to. But your suffering will soon be over. Your headache will go away. End quote.
At that moment, Pilate has a sudden attack of the pain. It worsens for a little bit and then begins to subside, and he starts to feel better. Seeing that the pain is past, Yeshua says that he's glad it's over, and he goes on to say,
I'd advise you, Hegemon, to leave the palace for a while and go for a stroll somewhere in the vicinity, say in the gardens on the Mount of Olives. A storm will come. The prisoner turns, narrowing his eyes at the sun. Later on, towards evening, a stroll would do you much good, and I would be glad to accompany you. Certain new thoughts have occurred to me, which I think you might find interesting, and I'd willingly share them with you. The more so as you give the impression of being a very intelligent man. The trouble is that you're too closed off and have definitely lost faith in people. You must agree one can't place all one's affection in a dog. Your life is impoverished, hegemon. End quote.
And what's happening here outside of the quotes that we read is that all the attendants and centurions and scribes that are, the silent witnesses of this exchange between the procurator and the prisoner, is they're astounded at the level of impudence, from their viewpoint of Yeshua so familiarly addressing the procurator and talking to him as a human and not as a extreme authority figure. And so their jaws are literally dropping open, and the scribe forgets to keep recording because of the level of familiarity. And Pilate, is continuously more and more interested in and liking Yeshua, and Yeshua's presence seems to have a healing effect on Pilate. It's almost like Yeshua's healing. It's almost supernatural in the level his influence has, but it's nothing overt. It's subtle. It's Yeshua speaking and addressing him like a fellow human being and caring for him, and speaking his insights seems to coincide with the pain in his head subsiding. And that seems to, alleviate that suffering for Pilate. And so that, combined with just the freshness and authenticity of Yeshua, really attracts Pilate to Yeshua.
So what do you think, Leo, of these characters, which are clearly biblical characters, and yet they're kind of a parody, but they're not mocking or making fun of it, but they're clearly distinct from what we expect? Right.
Very different from the historical figures. This is one that, I've wrapped my head around a lot, and, part of my deep diving nature on this makes me wonder, because we're getting this from the perspective of Woland. Woland's, especially in the beginning, the one relating the story of Yeshua and Pilate. And so why would the devil tell the truth? And why would he tell this story at all? So the question is Woland purposefully or accidentally being an unreliable narrator, or is Bulgakov himself saying something different by having, characters of biblical stories radically different from how they were portrayed in the Bible itself? So those are two directions I kind of go with it. And if I'm going down the Bulgakov intention road to figure out what's there, maybe one guess is that he wants to make the forces of good less supernatural, because all the supernatural power seems to be on Woland's side. The forces of, the other side of divinity seeming more mundane, or maybe even hinting that the devil is the only supernatural power, because the other side of divinity is only ever alluded to in the smallest glimpses throughout the story. It's all focused on the devil side, as it were. So there's any number of things he could be doing here, and to me it's just fascinating that he chose to do this.
We don't get to see firsthand any divinity occur in the story. We don't get to see glorious or miraculous events happen. In fact, we only get to see black magic. We don't get to see any holiness or white magic.
Right. And it goes back to the epigraph that I think, the through line of the epigraph runs through the whole novel of he wills evil but works good. And through his willing evil, good occurs. And that's kind of what we see with Woland.
Is that good occurs eventually?
Good occurs. Arguably a form of good occurs, and at least from the viewpoint of Mephistopheles, the Woland character.
I think that's the only character that sees good happen, because otherwise you have a beheading, you have an insane asylum, you have people dying on stage. I think Woland's the only one that sees the good occur.
Unless those are forms of justice being meted out.
Unless it's forms of justice.
It's hard.
Or is this all just a metaphor for the Soviet state in which demons are all around and there are no angels? And Pontius Pilate is simply the censorship that Bulgakov has to go through, because he is Yeshua, healing people from the tragedy of being stuck in the human existence while having no alternative but to be silenced by the judges and hegemons
right.
of the time.
And Yeshua, is a representative for humanity itself, humaneness itself. And Pontius Pilate has a human side that has to be suppressed and quashed. And even though he is a benefactor of and participant in the regime's power, he at the same time is kind of a victim, much like in the Soviet system where people who are higher up in the ranks or part of the secret police had to do atrocious things physically, psychologically, morally to carry out the regime's efforts and directions and wishes. But at the same time, while they were willing participants in it, they were still caused to do moral evil. And this is the case for Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, so I could see maybe there's deeper stuff there, but I could definitely see the relationship of Bulgakov being Yeshua, but that also being a stand-in for humanitarians at the time that were trying to express the human existence and them obviously being oppressed in the censorship era.
And it could also just simply be Bulgakov could have been viewing these from an atheistic standpoint and wanted to portray a version that would make sense from an atheistic standpoint, but then still having Wolin being the main axis around which the novel turns.
So then how do you think Yeshua is supposed to be read in this? Is Yeshua a fool? Is he truly innocent? Is he, a cult leader level genius where he is so insightful?
I think he comes off the page to me as a bit of a misunderstood genius, he has a bit of powerlessness to him. He has almost the Cassandra effect of being able to very insightfully speak the truth, but that it's kind of ineffectual. It doesn't seem to flourish or grow. He has the potential for truth and goodness to be spread from what he says, and he's speaking, a lot of truth, and he's doing so very insightfully and powerfully, but it doesn't seem to ever catch, and he ultimately gets executed. So for me, a misunderstood genius. For me, he comes off as a mundane figure with powers of insight, savant level powers of insight that are so keen that it causes a kind of subtle healing effect. He is a teacher, and Pontius Pilate otherwise would love to associate with him and benefit from his presence.
So how do you feel about Yeshua's actions, how empathetic he is, how considerate he is to Pontius Pilate, how he almost seems to have the exact answer to helping him, and he in some ways is, like you're saying, an oracle for the future. He's like, this will happen, the storm will come, your headache will go away, all of this. Do you feel that there's a philosophy that Bulgakov is trying to portray through these characters? Is there some dichotomy that we're supposed to pick up on?
I think what's being portrayed here, now that we're talking about it and thinking about it, is what we mentioned in the intro, the overview of everything, that maybe the ultimate message here is that power can suppress truth and justice and goodness for a time, but it can't do it permanently. And while Yeshua loses, so to speak, that this is pointing to a time when the regime will fall. There is pointing to a time when truth and justice can come out on top, finally.
He does seem to be the symbol of truth and justice, and he seems to have, much like the biblical portrayal of Jesus, a almost unlimited compassion towards people. And we can see that in one of the ways where he always talks about people as good, a good person, good man, or people as in good people. So how do you feel about Yeshua's use of good people?
I think that just, it's almost written to an absurd degree, but that speaks to the absurd utopian level of goodness that he sees in other people. He has the power of insight, and he's seeing, in my opinion, he's genuinely seeing like the best part of people, the goodness in people. And the reader, has to decide for him or herself what they're seeing there. Are they seeing that? Are they seeing a power of insight, or are they seeing someone who's fooling themselves and is missing the cynical dark side of humanity for a delusion? For me, I'd like to think he's seeing goodness in people and seeing, past everything else that's clouding the goodness in Pontius Pilate.
I feel that through this literature and several other literary works, the question comes up again and again, are people inherently good or evil? And there's been many different ways at attacking this, either through psychological research that we see in the 1900s and now we see psychological and scientific approaches towards that, but also historically we see plenty of people all the way back to Aristotle trying to understand the essence of man in the very beginning. Are we inherently good? Are we inherently evil?
While Yeshua may seem a little diluted to me, it's not that he's ignoring the bad part of people. It's that he is just much more interested in the good part of people. Jill, do you think it means anything that while Yeshua seems to be a very sympathetic figure and seems to have this power of insight and healing and is very likable, that he dies and is executed and ends? What do you think, if anything, Bulgakov is saying by that? Is he using Yeshua as a stand-in for a particular philosophy there?
My interpretation, if we're jumping to the end of the book here, is that Bulgakov had Yeshua as a character, and his death in particular represents that there will be sacrifices for goodness, that on the road to ultimate justice and freedom, because that's one of the themes in the book, is that justice and truth outlive oppression. You can't get away from the fact that there will be death or sacrifice on the way to there. So Yeshua, even later in the story, I believe, talks about that, and he's like, yeah, you're gonna have to execute me, you're doing all this. He has that foresight, and he's perfectly okay with that price being paid via his own life.
And then speaking of ambiguity, that ambiguity of the way Yeshua comes off in situations like that, where he's being condemned and he's being treated unfairly and other people are changing the narrative around him, he doesn't lose his temper, he doesn't lash out, and he doesn't stop seeing people as, quote, good people. The ambiguity there is, it's up to the reader, in my opinion, to determine, is he just being naive and foolish and passive and impotent, or is there strength in that? Is there strength in maintaining your inner calm and continuing to be able to see the goodness in people despite these unfair circumstances and despite this unfair, gruesome fate? And it's not clear. At least to me, the ambiguity is there on purpose for the reader to grapple with.
Right. And I think if we add to the ambiguity, we see that this story is within the overarching story, and it's being told by the devil. And so why is the devil here defending the existence of Jesus? Why is he telling the story? And is he an unreliable narrator because he is the devil? Or is this just part of the truth that the devil has? Because if this person really exists, then why would he deny it?
Right. So traditional, Christian viewpoint, why the heck would the ultimate deceiver be defending a Jesus-like character? Why would he be talking about it? Why would he be worried about that whatsoever? So like you're saying, the story of Yeshua and Pontius Pilate doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is nested within a story. It's a story within a story, and the narrator within the story is the devil. The devil is the one narrating this. So do we believe everything he says at face value? Is he unreliable on purpose or accidentally from his viewpoint? What's happening there? He could be acting out some form of deception or self-deception, and I don't know. Like you're saying, this just is another layer to add to that ambiguity. One thing upon reviewing the notes and looking back through everything on this read is one simpler explanation might just be that his seventh proof, which we will talk about, but his proof of the existence of the devil is the proof of the existence of the other side of the Christian divinity that is not the devil. So if I can prove to you one side of it, that also proves the devil, and vice versa. If I can prove to you the devil's real, then that proves divinity in general is real.
That's true. That's fair.
And then to take that a few more levels, maybe that is a deeper point of the novel itself, and feel free to reel me back into the boat here, but the fact that maybe the whole book is a seventh proof. Maybe the whole book is, hey, look, here is very clear evidence of evil and the devil, and that has to imply an opposing goodness.
I suppose that's possible. In this book itself, we see evil being represented more so than goodness being represented. If we were to pull into the divinity aspect, I wonder what the ideas around death or the devil are for orthodoxy, which was oppressed at the time, versus, the written text itself. And I don't know, because there's more depictions of the devil in like the zeitgeist of Christianity than there are in the canonical texts.
Very much so. And, this is not to say that Bulgakov has a theological or religious secret message hidden in this book, because he was an atheist, to my knowledge. He was very atheistic. So if he is pointing at, a transcendent goodness or divinity, it's not in a religious sense, so to speak. It might be the transcendence of art and truth itself, eventually overcoming oppressive power.
I would even think, if we're looking at a theological argument for this, Bulgakov kind of can give us maybe a humorous look at this when he introduces Matthew Levy, where Matthew Levy follows Yeshua around. And when they start talking about Matthew Levy, Yeshua says, quote, "There's one with a goatskin parchment who follows me and keeps writing all the time. But once I peeked into this parchment and was horrified. I said decidedly nothing of what's written there. I implored him, 'Burn your parchment for God's sake.' But he tore it out of my hands and ran away." End quote.
Yeah, this is another very fun character we see here.
Right. So
and what Matthew Levy might be writing is, a stand-in for the Christian text that actually exist in the real world. So maybe Bulgakov is here implying that, that's not how stuff happened whatsoever, but crazy, zealous followers transformed it from the get-go into something that eventually ended up being from an atheistic standpoint, a highly magical religion.
Right. And at this time, they would have the knowledge, the historicity, I'm probably pronouncing that word wrong, but the historicity, or basically our understanding of what we can historically verify with these types of religious texts in between, say, the Torah or the New Testament, any of that, and how we have no writings whatsoever from this Jesus character, but we have writings from other people that talk to other people about this supposed character. And in this way, Matthew Levy is a really good hypothesis if it's put in here as a theological insert of like, oh, some crazy people just took what this really nice guy was saying and completely messed it all up.
And you could apply that to any of the main religions we see. That, okay, there were initiating figures, but we've been playing a long-standing game of telephone ever since. How much has changed in the retelling?
Right, that's true. That's very true.
So that's my interpretation of what Matthew Levy might be writing. Do you have a different interpretation of, what in the world? Because we never see what's on the parchment. Do you have an interpretation?
I don't. I have no idea.
So, in your opinion, Joel, is Matthew Levy a fanatical true believer that is doing a dangerously inept job of conveying his teacher's story? Or is he purposefully manipulating the Yeshua phenomenon for a different agenda?
I think both of those are wonderful paths down a conspiratorial hypothesis, and both are great, but I personally don't see us getting an answer to any direction throughout the entire
Well, Bulgakov can't tell me, so that's why I'm asking your opinion.
I wish I knew, but I think it's up for interpretation.
And you don't find yourself leaning one way or the other?
He seems to be fanatical. I mean, from Yeshua's own words, he himself says that he's a bit of a fanatic.
Right. And for me, instances like this where it's ambiguous, for me, I love the fact that it can be one or both or neither. I love the way that it's written. It's masterful writing because it's ambiguity on purpose. And there's kind of a cloud there over, okay, is he just an inept true believer, or is he working on another agenda that is just separate from what Yeshua intended? And is he doing that on purpose? And that kind of uncertainty adds to, again, the dreamlike quality of the novel itself.
Lots of powerfully interwoven uncertainty in this story and the main story.
So we talked a little bit about the powerlessness that Yeshua seems to have. And, he's powerless in his interactions with Pilate, with Matthew Levy, who's his supposed follower. He's also powerless in his interactions with Judas. And he never seems to have the upper hand or to have any kind of say in what's going on. He can't affect or change the behavior of people around him, even though he has the level of insight that he does. And even the narrative that's being spun around him by the authorities, by Matthew Levy, by everyone else, they're telling his story, even though he is for the time still alive. Joel, do you think the reader is meant to read this powerlessness any particular way? Is this meant to say something, the powerlessness specifically, that just seems to be a motif of Yeshua as a character?
What I got from it is related to my hypothesis that Yeshua is a stand-in for Bulgakov and other humanitarian writers at the time, where they have this powerful insight. They're great literary geniuses, and they're giving the insights throughout their works, whether it be a playwright or whether it be the novel, and yet they're powerless to change the society that they're in. They're only there to give the truth that will outlive them. That's my best hypothesis.
That makes sense. Yeah, because Bulgakov is at the mercy of Stalin's whims, at the regime's whims. They say if he keeps walking about as a quasi-free man or not. I like that interpretation. And there's definitely a powerlessness that is involved in being a citizen under a Soviet regime. And it doesn't matter the level of humanity or insight or capabilities that you have. It's all controlled, beginning to end, by the state. Joel, I think that is a great note to end our first part of this discussion on. What do you think?
That sounds great. We did it. We did the first part of it.
Okay, friends. Well, I hope you've enjoyed coming along this conversation with us for our first discussion here on The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. As always, thank you for listening. This has been the Deep Dive Book Club podcast.
If you would like to reach us, please look at the show notes for all the places you can reach us. Give us your thoughts, opinions, feelings, ideas, whatever you want to share. And with that, Leo, is there anything else?
That is it.
Otherwise, we'll see y'all next week.